He didn't die. He wasn't buried. He left no tomb. Elijah simply vanished before his disciples' eyes, carried to heaven by a chariot of fire drawn by flaming horses, while a whirlwind snatched him from the earth. Imagine witnessing that. Imagine seeing someone you know, who ate alongside you, who walked the same dusty roads as you, literally taken by the sky in living flames. It's not fiction. It's not legend distorted by time. It's the historical record of one of the most extraordinary events ever documented in antiquity. But before that cinematic ending, there was a journey, and what a journey it was. This is the man who single-handedly faced 450 rival prophets on a mountaintop, challenging them to prove which God was real. The same man who called down fire from heaven before entire crowds, consuming not only the sacrifice, but the stone, the earth, and even the water surrounding the altar. The prophet who closed the heavens for 3.5 years, stopping the rain at his word, and then brought it back with the same authority. Elijah was so powerful, so connected to the divine, so feared by kings and queens, that his name became synonymous with supernatural power. But here lies the paradox no one expects. This same spiritual giant, after his greatest victories, fled in terror to the desert, hid in a cave, and begged to die. Depression, exhaustion, absolute loneliness. How can someone call down fire from heaven one week and be emotionally broken the next? How did the most powerful prophet of his generation reach the point of giving up on life so soon after his most spectacular triumph? And why, after all this, was he the only man in biblical history, along with Enoch, never to experience death? These contradictions don't weaken Elijah's story. They make it deeply human. They reveal that spiritual power doesn't immunize anyone against emotional fragility, that public victories don't guarantee inner peace, that even the chosen face the darkness of the soul. The story of Elijah takes place during one of the darkest periods in Israel's history. King Ahab had married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess who brought with her not only political influence, but also a systematic campaign to replace the worship of the God of Israel with the worship of Baal, the god of fertility and storms. Temples were built. Prophets of the true God were persecuted and killed. The entire nation was being dragged into a collective apostasy, and divine silence seemed to confirm that all was lost. It was into this dark landscape that Elijah appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, with no recorded genealogy, no official credentials, only a devastating message. There would be no more rain until he said otherwise. 3 years of drought, 3 years of progressive famine, 3 years in which Elijah was hunted as public enemy number 1, accused of being the cause of the national tragedy. Meanwhile, he was miraculously sustained, first by ravens that brought him bread and meat twice a day, then by a poor widow whose oil and flour never ran out while he remained in her house. When this widow's son died, Elijah prayed and brought him back to life, in one of the first recorded resurrection accounts in history. But all this was just the prelude. The real confrontation was yet to come. On Mount Carmel, before all the assembled people, Elijah proposed a deadly challenge, that the prophets of Baal call upon their God to send fire from heaven, and then he would do the same. The God who responded with fire would be recognized as the true God. The prophets of Baal shouted, danced, and cut themselves with knives from morning until evening, but nothing happened. Elijah mocked them, suggesting that perhaps Baal was traveling, busy, or asleep. When his turn came, he rebuilt a destroyed altar, dug a trench around it, placed the wood and the sacrifice, and ordered water to be poured over it 3 times until the trench overflowed. Then he prayed. A simple, direct prayer, without hysteria. And the fire descended. It not only burned the sacrifice, but consumed the wood, the stones, the dust, and licked up all the water in the trench. The people fell face down. The prophets of Baal were executed that very day. The rain returned. It was the greatest spiritual victory of a generation. Elijah was at his peak, and it was precisely then that everything fell apart. Jezebel, furious over the death of her prophets, vowed to kill Elijah within 24 hours. And this man, who had faced 450 adversaries without blinking, who had just witnessed literal fire descend from heaven in answer to his prayer, fled in terror into the desert, walked 40 days to a cave on Mount Horeb, and there declared that he wished to die. He had forgotten everything God had done. He saw himself as the only faithful one left, abandoned, a failure. But it was in that dark cave, at his most vulnerable moment, that Elijah received one of the most profound revelations about the nature of God. Not in the earthquake, not in the fire, not in the violent wind, but in a still, small voice, God spoke to him. He revealed that there were 7,000 people in Israel who had not bowed down to Baal, that he was not alone, that his mission was not finished, and that he was to anoint his successor, a young man named Elisha, who would receive a double portion of his spirit. The following years were spent mentoring. Elijah established schools of prophets, trained disciples, and prepared the next generation. And when the time came for his departure, he knew it. Elisha knew it too. Other prophets knew it. There was a silent farewell as they traveled together through the last cities. When they reached the Jordan River, Elijah took off his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the waters, allowing them both to cross on dry land. On the other side, Elijah asked Elisha what he wanted before his departure. The answer was bold: a double portion of, the spirit that was in Elijah. And then it happened. A chariot of fire, drawn by horses of fire, descended between them. A whirlwind separated them, and Elijah ascended to heaven in that flaming whirlwind, his cloak falling at Elisha's feet. But the story doesn't end there. Centuries later, on the last page of the Old Testament, there is a disconcerting prophecy. Elijah will return before the great and terrible day of the Lord. In the New Testament scriptures, when Jesus was transfigured before, 3 of his disciples, 2 men appeared, talking to him about his upcoming death in Jerusalem. One was Moses, who had died and been buried. The other was Elijah, who had never died. And when people asked about this prophecy of Elijah's return, Jesus pointed to John the Baptist, saying that he had come in the spirit and power of Elijah. But he also left open the possibility of a future, eschatological fulfillment of this promise. What makes Elijah so fascinating is not only the supernatural that permeated his life, but the raw humanity he displayed. He wasn't a superhero immune to fear, fatigue, or despair. He was someone like us, subject to the same passions, as James describes in the New Testament. His prayers were powerful not because he was inherently special, but because he truly believed, because his faith wasn't theoretical. It was tested in the wilderness, in hunger, in loneliness, in direct confrontation with established systems of power. He knew what it was like to be broken, and yet have to rise and carry on. He knew the bitter taste of public victory followed by private collapse. This is the journey of a man who defied the impossible, faced the political and religious power of his time, performed miracles that defy rational comprehension, fell into the deepest depression after his greatest victory, was restored by divine tenderness in a cave, formed a legacy through his disciple, and was taken from earth without experiencing death, a visual demonstration that there are dimensions of reality that science cannot yet measure. And his story continues to resonate because he represents something we all yearn for, the certainty that God is real, that the supernatural can invade the natural, that our weaknesses do not disqualify us, and that our end does not have to be the end. Prepare yourself, because what you are about to discover about Elijah may completely change your understanding of faith, power, human frailty, and the inexplicable. Elijah's story begins abruptly and unceremoniously, almost as if he had appeared out of nowhere, unannounced, with no credentials to present. Scripture simply says that Elijah the Tishbite, a resident of Gilead, appeared before King Ahab with a declaration that sounded more like a court sentence than a prophecy. There would be neither dew nor rain in the coming years, except at his word. Imagine the audacity. An unknown man, likely dressed in the rough garb of a prophet, invading the royal palace to announce a national catastrophe as if he had authority to control the heavens. Ahab, who had already committed spiritual prostitution by marrying Jezebel and importing the worship of Baal, must have been somewhere between shock and disdain. But Elijah didn't stay to debate. He simply delivered the message and disappeared, leaving the king and the entire court to process what had just happened. What Elijah did was strategic and deeply symbolic. Baal was worshipped as the god of storms and fertility, the one who supposedly controlled the rain and ensured the harvest. By declaring a years-long drought, Elijah was exposing Baal's powerlessness before the God of Israel. It was a direct challenge to the religious system Jezebel had imposed on the nation. Each day without rain was a public humiliation for the prophets of Baal, who certainly performed rituals and ceremonies to summon rain, to no avail. The drought became a silent but devastating sermon, preached day after day by the empty sky. The scorching sun, the dying crops, and the drying rivers. And somewhere hidden, Elijah watched it all unfold, knowing he was literally at war with an entire system. But Elijah's courage was not recklessness or suicidal fanaticism. God had specifically instructed him what to do after delivering the message to the king. He was to hide by the Cherith Brook east of the Jordan, where he would drink from the stream and be fed by ravens that would bring him bread and meat morning and evening. It's almost comical to imagine the scene. A fugitive prophet being served by birds normally considered unclean according to Jewish law. God has a keen sense of irony, using precisely unfit creatures to sustain his servant, while the people who had prostituted themselves to false gods began to starve. The ravens never missed a single day. 2 meals a day delivered with precision, while the brook provided fresh water. It was a minimalist, solitary yet safe and provided existence. Eventually, like all, water under a rainless sky, the stream dried up. And then came the next divine instruction, even stranger than the first. Elijah was to go to Zarephath, a Phoenician city, Jezebel's territory, to be supported by a widow, not by a prosperous man, not by a wealthy family, but by a woman alone, a stranger in enemy territory. When Elijah found her gathering sticks at the city gate, he asked her for water and bread. Her answer was devastating in its honesty. She had only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a cruse. He was about to prepare a final meal for himself and his son, for them to eat and then starve to death. It was literally the end of the line. There was no plan B, no hidden reserves, no hope beyond that last piece of bread. And it was precisely in this moment of absolute desperation that Elijah asked something that seems cruel at first, that she first bake a small cake for him and then prepare something for herself and her son. But along with the request came a promise that defied all logic. The flour in the jar would not run out, and the oil in the jug would not run dry until the day God sent rain upon the earth. The woman had a brutal choice: trust a stranger who spoke for a God she barely knew, or ensure that her son had at least one last decent meal. She chose to trust, and the miracle began. Day after day, week after week, month after month, whenever she looked in the jar of flour, there was flour. Whenever she tilted the jug of oil, it flowed. It wasn't absurd amounts, it wasn't a lavish feast, but it was exactly enough, perpetually replenished by a mathematics that escaped known physics. Living in that house must have been a surreal experience. Every meal was a tangible reminder that something beyond the natural was at work. Every time the widow took flour that shouldn't have been there, poured oil from a jar that should have been empty, she witnessed the impossible become mundane. And Elijah, accustomed to grand confrontations and dramatic prophetic utterances, learned something equally important during that time. God also works in silent miracles, in daily provisions, in anonymous faithfulness that no one sees except those directly involved. There was no audience, no public recognition, just 3 people in a simple home experiencing supernatural sustenance while the rest of the world starved. It's a different kind of miracle, but no less powerful. Then the unthinkable happened. The widow's son, her only precious possession in this world, fell gravely ill and died. The woman who had trusted Elijah's God enough to risk her son's last meal now saw that same dead son in her arms, and her reaction was human and understandable. She accused Elijah of coming to her house to remind her of her iniquities and kill her son. It was pain speaking, the absolute despair of a mother who had lost literally everything. Elijah didn't argue, didn't try to explain theology or defend God. He simply picked up the dead boy, went up to his room, laid him on his own bed, and began to cry out to God with desperate intensity. Why bring this tragedy upon the widow who had taken him in? He then stretched himself out 3 times over the boy's body, begging God to restore life to that child. And life returned. The boy breathed again, opened his eyes, and rose from the dead. Elijah brought him back down and handed him to his mother with simple words. "See, your son lives." Her reaction summed it all up. "Now I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." It wasn't the miracle of the flour and oil, spectacular as it was, that produced this absolute certainty. It was seeing her son, who was definitely dead, come back to life in the prophet's arms. It's hard to argue with resurrection. It's hard to remain skeptical when you hold in your arms someone you'd lost to death and is now alive, warm, breathing, smiling. That moment sealed that woman's faith in a way 1,000 sermons never could. And for Elijah, it was preparation. If God could bring life back to the dead in a dark house in Zarephath, what else could he do? 3 years, 3 full years of relentless drought, growing famine, national despair. And finally, God's word came to Elijah again. It was time to present himself to Ahab, for the rains were about to return. But before meeting the king, Elijah crossed paths with Obadiah, the palace steward, a man who secretly feared God and had hidden 100 prophets in caves during Jezebel's persecution, sustaining them with bread and water. Obadiah was desperately searching for pasture and water for the royal animals when he encountered Elijah. The irony is delicious. The kingdom was so devastated that even the king's horses and mules were on the verge of death. And when Elijah asked Obadiah to arrange a meeting with Ahab, the steward nearly panicked, certain that Elijah would disappear again and he would be executed for giving the king false hope. But Elijah assured him he would appear that very day. And when the meeting finally took place, Ahab greeted him with a bitter accusation. "Are you the one troubling Israel?" Elijah's response was devastating in its clarity. "It is not I who are troubling Israel, but you and your father's house, for having abandoned the Lord's commandments and followed the Baals." And then came the challenge that would change everything. Ahab would gather all Israel on Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. It would be the ultimate confrontation, the public judgment that would decide once and for all which God was real. Ahab accepted, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because even he was desperate for rain, perhaps because he thought his prophets would crush this lonely and troubled prophet. No matter the motivation, the stage was set. On Mount Carmel, before gathered crowds, Elijah asked a question that still echoes through the centuries. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. The people did not answer. They remained in awkward silence because the truth was they wanted both. They wanted tradition and the new, the God of their fathers and the gods that promised easy prosperity. They wanted spiritual insurance to bet on every horse, to commit themselves completely to nothing. Elijah then proposed the test. 2 bulls, 2 altars, prepared wood, but no fire. The prophets of Baal would call upon their God to send fire, and then Elijah would do the same. The God who answered with fire would be recognized as the true God. It was a perfectly fair challenge, public, verifiable, impossible to falsify in front of thousands of witnesses. The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their altar, dismembered the bull, placed it on the wood, and began to call out, "Baal, answer us." They shouted from morning until noon. They danced around the altar with elaborate ritual movements. Nothing happened. No fire, no lightning, no sign. And then Elijah began to mock them with a biting sarcasm that must have been humiliating. He suggested they shout louder because perhaps Baal was too busy to hear, or perhaps he had gone on a journey, or was asleep and needed to be awakened. Elijah's mockery was not gratuitous cruelty. It was prophetic exposition. He was ridiculing the idea that a true deity would need to be awakened or could be distracted or had human limitations. It was a devastating critique of the very theology behind Baal worship. The prophets of Baal desperately intensified their efforts. They screamed louder, began cutting themselves with knives and spears until blood gushed, and entered frantic prophetic trances. From noon until the time of the afternoon sacrifice, they continued crying out, bleeding, exhausted. But there came no voice, no answer, no sign of attention. 450 men, trained in the mystical arts of their religion, using every ritual device they knew, were greeted only by absolute silence. Heaven remained empty. Baal, if he existed, was noticeably absent. And every minute that passed without a response was another layer of humiliation on the entire religious system Jezebel had imposed on the nation. The stage was set for Elijah, but by this point, the tension must have been unbearable. When Elijah's turn finally came, he did something completely unexpected. Instead of using the existing altar, he rebuilt an ancient altar to the Lord that had been torn down, using 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. It was a deeply symbolic act, a declaration that he represented not one faction, but the entire nation. Around the altar, he dug a trench. He arranged the wood, prepared the bull, and set everything in order. And then he gave an instruction that must have seemed insane: to fill 4 large jars with water and pour it over the sacrifice, and the wood, and then do it again and again. 3 times the water was poured until everything was soaked and the surrounding trench overflowed. There would be absolutely no possibility of human trickery. No hidden fire, no preserved spark, no natural explanation. He was eliminating any room for doubt. Then Elijah prayed. There was no hysteria, no courtship or dancing, no hours of desperate pleading. It was a simple, direct, confident prayer. Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people may know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back. The prayer lasted perhaps a minute, perhaps less, and then the fire fell. Not an ordinary fire, not natural flames that would gradually consume the sacrifice. This fire descended from heaven like a concentrated beam of divine power, and it not only burned the bull and the wood, but also consumed the very stones of the altar, licked up the surrounding dust, and completely evaporated all the water in the trench. It was so intense, so supernatural, so unmistakably divine, that there was no room for skepticism. The people's reaction was instantaneous and unanimous. They fell face down and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" It wasn't conversion by philosophical argument. It was submission in the face of irrefutable evidence. They had just witnessed something that completely escaped any natural explanation. Elijah then ordered the prophets of Baal captured, not to escape. Right there, by the Kishon River, the 450 were executed. It was severe justice by modern standards, but within the context of that time and culture, it was the prescribed penalty for false prophets who led the nation into idolatry. The corrupt religious system that had dominated Israel for years was dismantled in a single day, in a single event, through an undeniable display of divine power. Baal had been exposed as a fraud. The God of Israel had irrefutably manifested himself, but the day wasn't over yet. Elijah told Ahab to go up to eat and drink, because there was already the sound of abundant rain. Think about it. The sky was still completely clear, not a single cloud, no sign of weather change. But Elijah heard something no one else could hear. So he climbed to the top of Carmel, bowed down to the ground with his face between his knees, and sent his servant to look toward the sea. The servant looked and saw nothing. Elijah told him to look again. 7 times the servant went and came back, 7 times reporting a blank sky. The 7th time, he saw a small cloud, the size of a man's hand, rising from the sea. That was all Elijah needed. He sent word to Ahab to prepare his chariot and hurry down before the rain stopped him. Soon the sky darkened with clouds and wind, and torrential rain fell. The 3.5-year drought ended exactly as Elijah had said it would, on the day he had determined, by the word he had proclaimed. And in a final act of supernatural vigor, the hand of the Lord was upon Elijah, so that he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot for approximately 20 miles to the entrance of Jezreel. A man running faster than horses pulling a chariot. It was the day of greatest triumph in Elijah's prophetic career. Fire from heaven, rain after years of drought, execution of the false prophets, restoration of the people, an irrefutable public demonstration of God's power. If ever there was a moment of absolute victory, this was it. Elijah should have been at his peak, invincible, unshakable. But that's precisely when history takes a turn no one expected. When Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets of Baal, the queen sent a messenger to Elijah with a direct threat. "May the gods deal with you with all their might if I do not make you what you did to them by this time tomorrow." It was a death sentence with a 24-hour deadline. And Elijah's reaction is so shocking it almost makes no sense. He was afraid, got up, and ran for his life. This is the same man who had faced Ahab fearlessly, the same man who had challenged 450 prophets single-handedly, the same man who had just witnessed fire descend from heaven in answer to his prayer, and now he was fleeing in terror from a threat uttered by a woman he had just spiritually defeated in a devastating way. It makes no rational sense, but it makes perfect human sense. Elijah ran to Beersheba on the southern border of Judah, where he left his servant, and then walked another day's journey through the desert until he sat under a juniper tree. There, in that desolate and lonely place, this spiritual giant prayed for death. His words were of utter desperation. "It is enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Consider the contrast. Days before he had raised the widow's son from the dead. Now he wanted to die. Days before he had called down fire from heaven. Now he saw himself as a complete failure. Days before, he had supernaturally run ahead of a chariot. Now he barely had the strength to continue living. What had happened? How could someone fall so quickly from such a high peak? The truth is, Elijah was exhausted physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He had been under constant pressure for 3.5 years. He had performed public miracles that required immense faith and courage. He had faced systematic opposition from the entire political and religious establishment of the kingdom. The confrontation at Carmel, though victorious, must have been emotionally draining. The supernatural 30-kilometer race had left him physically exhausted. And now, just when he expected everything to change, for the people to turn completely to God, for the national leadership to embrace spiritual reform, he discovered that Jezebel remained in power and even more determined to kill him. The disappointment was crushing. He had given everything, risked everything, and it seemed nothing had truly changed in the places that mattered. The king was still weak, the queen was still evil, and he was still a man marked for death. Elijah fell asleep under that bush in the desert, probably expecting never to wake again. But he was touched by an angel who simply told him, "Get up and eat." Beside his head was a loaf of bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate, drank, and went back to sleep. The angel touched him a second time with the same instruction, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too long for you." God didn't rebuke Elijah for his weakness, shame him for his fear, or lecture him on his lack of faith. He simply fed him. He acknowledged his humanity, his physical need, his legitimate exhaustion. It is one of the most tender moments in the entire biblical narrative. God, preparing meals for his broken prophet in the desert, ensuring he had the strength to carry on. Strengthened by that meal, Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, the very place where Moses had received the tablets of the law centuries before. There he entered a cave to spend the night. And then came the divine question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was a gentle but penetrating question, forcing him to articulate his inner state. Elijah's answer revealed the depth of his despair. "I have been zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, but the Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are seeking my life." He saw himself as the last soldier in a losing war, alone, defeated, marked for extinction. His perspective had become completely distorted by exhaustion and trauma. God then told him to leave the cave and stay on the mountain, because he was about to pass that way. What happened next was a lesson in the nature of God that Elijah desperately needed. An extremely strong and powerful wind shattered the mountains and broke the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a still, small whisper. When Elijah heard it, he covered his face with his cloak and went out to the entrance of the cave. God was not in the dramatic manifestations that Elijah had witnessed and worked during his ministry. He was in the still, small voice that spoke to his weary heart. The same question came again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he gave the same answer, once again exposing his perceived loneliness and despair. But this time, God not only comforted him, he redirected him. He instructed Elijah to return by the desert route to Damascus, where he was to anoint Hazael king over Syria, Jehu king over Israel, and Elisha prophet in his place. And then came the revelation that shattered the narrative of loneliness Elijah had constructed. God had preserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees had not bowed to Baal and whose mouths had not kissed him. Elijah was not alone. He never had been. There were thousands of faithful people scattered throughout the nation, hidden but resilient, keeping the flame alive in silence. His perception of complete abandonment was false, a product of his depression and exhaustion, not a reflection of reality. This experience in the cave fundamentally transformed Elijah. He learned that genuine spiritual power doesn't always come with external pyrotechnics. that God works in public spectacles as well as in private whispers, and perhaps especially in whispers, that our perception of isolation rarely matches the full reality, that exhaustion and depression can distort our vision even after great victories, and that God responds to human frailty not with harsh rebuke, but with provision, tenderness, and gentle redirection. Elijah came down from that mountain different from the man who had ascended it. He was still the same powerful prophet, but now tempered by humility, by an awareness of his own limitations, by the understanding that he was part of something greater than his individual mission. When Elijah met Elisha, the young man was plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen, working with the last yoke. He was a man of means, part of a prosperous family, with a predictable and comfortable future ahead of him. Elijah simply walked past him and threw his mantle over him. There was no formal interview, no detailed explanation of what was to come, just the prophetic mantle falling on the young farmer's shoulders. Elisha immediately understood the meaning. He left the oxen, ran after Elijah, and asked permission to kiss his father and mother goodbye, and then he would follow him. Elijah responded enigmatically, "Go, return. What have I done to you?" It was a subtle test of commitment. Elisha didn't hesitate. He returned, took his yoke of oxen, slaughtered them, used the plowing equipment as firewood to cook them, and gave the meat to the people. Then he arose and followed Elijah, becoming his servant. What Elisha did was radical and irreversible. By killing the oxen that represented his livelihood and burning the equipment that symbolized his profession, he was burning bridges, eliminating the possibility of returning to his former life. He would not be a casual follower who kept his options open. It was total commitment, a complete abandonment of what was to embrace what would be. And so began a mentoring relationship that would last years, where Elisha would not only observe Elijah operate in the supernatural, but also learn the deeper principles that underpinned that extraordinary ministry. He would see miracles, but he would also see Elijah's humanity, his struggles, his weaknesses, his absolute dependence on God. He would be prepared not only to replace Elijah, but to go beyond him. The following years were of less dramatic but equally important work. Elijah continued to confront kings when necessary, prophesying judgment when appropriate. But he also formed communities of prophets, prepared the next generation, and cemented the spiritual legacy that would surpass his own lifetime. He was no longer alone in carrying the weight of Israel's spiritual reformation. There were others, trained, equipped, ready to continue the work. And always at his side was Elisha, watching, learning, serving, being shaped for a destiny he did not yet fully understand. The relationship between them was that of spiritual father and son, teacher and disciple, prophet and successor. There was genuine affection, deep respect, and a silent transmission of wisdom that occurs not through formal lectures, but through shared life. Then came the day they both, I knew was coming, though they did not speak openly about it. Elijah knew he would be taken that day. Elisha knew. The prophets in the schools of Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho knew it too, driven by some collective spiritual perception that something monumental was about to happen. Elijah and Elisha departed from Gilgal, and Elijah tried repeatedly to get Elisha to stay behind, telling him to remain there while he went to Bethel, then to Jericho, then to the Jordan. Each time, Elisha responded with a vehement oath, "As the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." It was unwavering loyalty, an absolute refusal to abandon his master at the final moment. He would not miss this farewell for anything in the world. At each place they passed, the prophets of that place approached Elisha and asked in a low voice, "Do you know that the Lord will take your master from you today?" And each time Elisha would respond brusquely, "Yes, I know. Be quiet." He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want the reality verbalized, didn't want to emotionally process what he was about to lose. Sometimes impending grief is better faced in silence than in discussion. They continued walking, passing through the cities that marked the final points of Elijah's earthly journey, in a silent yet meaningful farewell. When they reached the Jordan River, 50 prophets were watching from afar, witnesses to what was about to happen. Elijah took off his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. The river parted, and they both crossed on dry ground, echoing the miracle Joshua had performed centuries earlier in bringing Israel to the Promised Land. Across the Jordan, Elijah finally addressed the issue directly. He asked Elisha what he could do for him before he was taken. Elisha's answer was bold to the point of audacity. "May a double portion of your spirit be upon me." He didn't ask for riches, honor, or a long life. He asked for what was most valuable about Elijah, the prophetic spirit that worked through him, but in double measure. It was the request of a firstborn for the main inheritance, applied spiritually. Elijah answered honestly, "You have asked a difficult thing. It was not in his power to grant it. It depended entirely on God. But there was one condition. If you see me when I am taken from you, it will be given to you. Otherwise, it will not." Elisha would have to keep his eyes fixed, not turn away, not waver, fully witness the moment of transition. It was a test of spiritual perception, of the ability to see beyond the natural to capture the supernatural. They continued walking and talking, perhaps reminiscing about past journeys, miracles witnessed, lessons learned. And then it happened. Suddenly, a chariot of fire, drawn by horses of fire, appeared, separating them. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a physical manifestation of celestial reality invading earthly space. The description is scant but electrifying. A chariot and horses made entirely of fire, not fire consuming physical matter, but fire as a primary substance, a vehicle of divine glory. They passed between Elijah and Elisha, physically separating them, and then a whirlwind, a mighty whirlwind of wind, enveloped Elijah and swept him upward into the sky. Elisha saw it all. He stared intently as his master was literally ripped from the earth, carried upward by forces that defied gravity and mortality. Elisha cried out as he watched, my father, the chariots of Israel, and their horsemen." It was recognition that Elijah had been more valuable to Israel's spiritual defense than their entire physical army. And then Elijah disappeared from view. He didn't die. He wasn't buried. He simply ceased to be present in the physical realm. Elisha tore his own clothes in two, a gesture of mourning and transition. Elijah's era was over. His era was beginning. Elijah's mantle had fallen during the ascension, descending back to earth as its owner ascended to heaven. Elisha picked it up, that same mantle that had been thrown over him years ago in the plowed field, now carrying the literal and symbolic weight of prophetic succession. Elisha returned and stood on the banks of the Jordan, holding Elijah's cloak. He rolled it up and struck the waters, crying out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The waters parted again, and he crossed over. The prophets watching from Jericho saw and declared, "The spirit of Elijah rests upon Elisha." The transfer was complete. The double portion had been granted. Elisha would continue working miracles for decades, performing twice the number of recorded miracles that Elijah performed, literally fulfilling the double portion request. But he never forgot that moment by the Jordan when he witnessed his master taken alive from the earth, when he held the still warm cloak of the prophetic presence, when he crossed the parted waters alone for the first time, now bearing the responsibility that once belonged to the man who had disappeared into the burning sky. Elijah's story doesn't end with his ascension. His presence permeates subsequent scriptures as an unfulfilled promise, a persistent expectation. The last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, closes with a puzzling prophecy. "Behold, I will send Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." It was a promise of return, of a mission not yet completed, of a restorative role that Elijah would fulfill before the final judgment. For centuries, the Jewish people awaited this literal return, so much so that to this day they reserve an empty chair for Elijah during Passover, hoping he will appear and announce the coming of the Messiah. When Jesus began his ministry, people constantly asked him about Elijah. Some thought Jesus was Elijah resurrected. Others wondered when Elijah would return to fulfill Malachi's prophecy. And then something extraordinary happened on the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus took Peter, James, and John to a high mountain, and there he was transfigured before them, his face shining like the sun, and his clothes becoming white as light. Two men appeared talking to him, identified as Moses and Elijah, discussing his upcoming death in Jerusalem. Peter, in the confusion of the moment, offered to build 3 tents, one for each. But what is theologically fascinating is that there were represented the law, through Moses, and the prophets, through Elijah, both pointing to Christ as the fulfillment of everything they represented. Jesus later clarified the issue of Elijah's return in a surprising way. When his disciples asked why the teachers of the law said Elijah had to come first, Jesus confirmed that Elijah would come and restore all things, but then added, "But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wished." The disciples understood him to be talking about John the Baptist, who came in the spirit and power of Elijah, dressed like him, preaching repentance like him, and confronting authorities like him. John had fulfilled the prophecy in a sense, preparing the way for Christ's first coming. But Jesus left open the possibility of a future, literal fulfillment, when Elijah would physically return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord mentioned in Malachi. The apostle James, writing to believers facing hardship, used Elijah as an example of effective prayer. He emphasized that Elijah was a man like us, subject to the same feelings. He was not a superhuman immune to common weaknesses. He was someone who experienced fear, depression, exhaustion, the same emotions we all face. And yet, his prayer was powerfully effective. He prayed fervently that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. He prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. James's lesson is profound. It is not our perfection that makes our prayers powerful. It is our genuine faith in a God who hears and answers. Elijah prayed effectively, not despite his humanity, but through it, bringing his weaknesses and needs before God with brutal honesty. Elijah's journey is much more than a collection of spectacular miracles or a morality tale about faith. It is a brutally honest mirror of the human experience when the divine invades the everyday, when impossible calls are placed on fragile shoulders, when spectacular victories fail to guarantee emotional stability, and when the supernatural becomes as real as the ground beneath our feet. Elijah was not chosen because he was exceptional in his human nature, but he became exceptional through his willingness to trust completely, even when all seemed lost, even when his own mind betrayed him with narratives of failure and isolation. He discovered that God doesn't need our strength, only our availability. He doesn't demand our perfection, only our honesty. He doesn't seek superheroes immune to fear, but real people willing to rise again after each fall. Have you ever felt alone in a battle that seems too great for you? Have you ever experienced the exhaustion that comes after giving your all and realizing there are still more mountains to climb? Have you ever felt fear right after a victory, when logically you should have been confident? Elijah understands. He was there, fleeing into the desert, asking to die, convinced he was the only one left. And he discovered, in the darkest cave of his despair, that God responds not with rebuke, but with meals prepared by angelic hands, with gentle questions that allow you to process the pain, with soft whispers that penetrate deeper than thunder. He discovered he was never alone, that there were thousands keeping the flame alive in silence, that his perception, distorted by exhaustion, did not match the reality God saw. Elijah's life challenges our modern need for natural explanations for everything. Fire descending from heaven cannot be reduced to convenient atmospheric phenomena. Flour and oil that perpetually reproduce defy the laws of conservation of mass. Resurrection of the dead doesn't fit known medical models. Physical ascension in a flaming chariot simply doesn't happen according to the physics we study. And that's precisely the point. Either reality is greater than our current scientific categories can capture, or we are looking at records of impossible events that were somehow preserved through millennia by completely different cultures who had no reason to invent stories that made them look foolish in front of their more sophisticated neighbors. Elijah forces us to confront the possibility that the universe is stranger, more mysterious, more permeable to the divine than our materialistic worldview allows. But beyond the supernatural, there is something even more disturbing in Elijah's story, the direct ethical challenge it presents. When he asked the people on Mount Carmel how long they would waver between two opinions, he wasn't engaging in empty rhetoric. He was exposing the impossibility of serving two masters, of keeping one foot on each side of the line, of seeking spiritual security through multiple policies. The people's silence in the face of this question is deafening because it is our own silence. How many of us live in intentional ambiguity, keeping options open, never fully committing to anything that requires real sacrifice? Elijah burned bridges. He confronted the king knowing he could die. He challenged 450 prophets single-handedly. He declared war on an entire system, not because he was reckless, but because there were truths worth risking everything for. And here's the question we can't avoid. What would you do if God answered your prayers the way he answered Elijah's? If literal fire came down from heaven when you prayed? If rain stopped or started at your word? If you saw someone rise from the dead before your eyes? Most of us say we want more faith, more spiritual power, more of the supernatural. But do we really want it? Because with that power comes overwhelming responsibility. It comes systematic opposition from established structures. It comes loneliness, because you'll see realities others can't. It comes exhaustion, because carrying genuine spiritual authority drains you in ways that performance. Ministry never does. Elijah paid the full price for every miracle, for every victory, for every battle won. The question isn't whether we want the results he achieved, but whether we're willing to pay the cost he paid. Elijah's ascension in a chariot of fire is the detail that transforms his story from inspiring to disturbing. Enoch and Elijah are the only men recorded in Scripture who never died. Both were taken, snatched from the earth without passing through the portal of death that awaits. Every human being. Why? What does this mean? One interpretation suggests that they are prototypes, demonstrations that death is not the inevitable end for humanity, that there is a reality beyond this physical dimension, that our bodies and consciousnesses can exist in states we do not yet fully understand. Elijah's ascension was not just his dramatic exit, it was a statement about the nature of reality, about possibilities that transcend our ordinary experience, about a God who is not limited by the rules we observe normally operating. So what do we make of all this? How does the story of an ancient prophet who defied kings, performed impossible miracles, fell into deep depression, was restored by divine tenderness, mentored a successor, and disappeared in a flaming chariot connect with your life now, today, in this moment as you read or hear these words? Here's the disconcerting truth. You are facing your own prophets of Baal, your own systems that promise life but deliver death, your own Jezebels that threaten to destroy you if you don't bow down. Maybe they're addictions you can't let go of. Maybe they're toxic relationships that are draining your soul. Maybe they're compromises you've made with false versions of success, fulfillment, happiness. Maybe it's the relentless inner voice that insists you're not enough, never were, never will be, and you are on a personal Mount Carmel right now, where you will have to choose. You can no longer waver between two opinions. You can no longer keep one foot on each side, because Elijah's life demonstrates that neutrality is not a viable option when absolute truths are at stake. You can try to serve two masters, but one will always receive your crumbs while the other receives your heart. You can try to maintain security through spiritual diversification, but you will find you are building on sand. Nothing stands when the storms come. Elijah's question echoes through the centuries to this very moment. How long will you waver? When will you stop negotiating and start living as if your convictions were truly true? But there is hope in Elijah's story, a profound hope that isn't cheap optimism. When you fail spectacularly right after your greatest victory, when you run in terror after being courageous, when you give up emotionally after giving your all, God doesn't abandon you. He prepares meals. He speaks in whispers. He corrects your distorted perception. He shows you that you are not alone. He gives you a new mission, a new purpose, a new direction. The cave of despair isn't your end. It's where you find the still, small voice that was speaking all along, but you were too busy with thunder and earthquakes to hear. Elijah teaches us that weakness isn't a failure. It's the place where we learn that our strength was never ours to begin with. It was always His, working through us, sustaining us when we didn't realize it, carrying us when we thought we were walking alone. Now comes the uncomfortable part. You're reading or listening to this story because something inside you recognizes that you've reached a decision point. It wasn't an accident that brought you here, to this moment, to these words. You're tired of wavering. You're ready for the showdown on the Mount Carmel of your life, where you'll finally discover if what you say you believe really works when tested under pressure. You're ready to see fire fall, or at least you're willing to be ready, which is all God needs to begin, because Elijah didn't have all the answers when he confronted the prophets of Baal. He wasn't absolutely certain that God would answer. He simply took a leap of faith, rebuilt the altar, soaked the sacrifice, and prayed honestly. And the fire came. So here's your challenge. Identify your Mount Carmel. What have you been avoiding confronting because the risk seems too great? What false structures in your life need to be exposed and dismantled? Where are you allowing modern-day Baals to receive worship that should go to the one true God? It could be your job that has become an idol, It could be a relationship you've idolized. It could be money, status, appearance, approval, control, security. It could be an old wound that you've transformed into an identity. It could be a narrative about yourself that you've embraced, but that is fundamentally false. Identify, name, confront, and be prepared for what comes next, because when you pray honestly and God responds with fire, your life will change in ways you can't predict or control. And when you inevitably fall into the cave of depression after victory, because you will, because we all do, remember that Elijah was there before you. The way back isn't through willpower or positive thinking or denying the pain. It's through accepting the meal God prepares, listening to the still small voice after the thunder passes, receiving the truth that corrects your distorted perception, discovering that you were never as alone as you thought, and then you rise again. Not because you've discovered new strength within yourself, but because you've discovered that the strength you've always needed comes from a source outside of you. Inexhaustible, always available, patiently waiting for you to stop trying to do it alone and accept help. Elijah's story didn't end when he ascended to heaven. It continues through Elisha and the prophets he trained. It continues through John the Baptist, who came in his spirit. It continues through every person who refuses to bow to the Baals of their generation, who dares to believe the impossible can happen, who chooses to stand when it would be easier to settle, who keeps the flame alive in dark times. You are part of this story now. The question is what role you will play. Will you be part of the throng that wavers endlessly, never making up its mind, always trying to please all sides? Or will you be someone who rebuilds broken altars, who prays honest prayers, who is willing to watch fire fall and deal with the consequences? If this story touched something deep within you, if it awakened a hunger for something more real than the performative religiosity that dominates much of modern spirituality, if it made you question whether you've been living too small when you're called to something greater, then don't let it die. Leave a comment now sharing what part of Elijah's story impacted you most. Was it the fire on Mount Carmel? The depression in the cave? The still, small voice? The ascension in flames? Share your reflection, because when you articulate what God is doing in you, it becomes more real, more concrete, less likely to be forgotten when the emotion of this moment passes. Subscribe to this channel because we'll continue exploring these stories that challenge our comfortable categories, that force us to confront the possibility that reality is stranger and more purposeful than we often admit. Turn on notifications because you won't want to miss the next one, where we'll delve into another story that will challenge everything you think you know about faith, power, and the impossible intersection between the human and the divine. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that weakness is not a disqualification, that falls are not final, that God still works in ways that escape our rational explanations. Because ultimately, Elijah's story is about true hope, not the cheap kind that ignores reality, but the profound kind that looks squarely at the impossible and says, still. It's about a God who doesn't abandon his servants when they break down, who prepares meals for the weary, who speaks in whispers to the desperate, who sends chariots of fire when it's time to leave. It's about the disturbing truth that you were made for more than the small, safe life culture offers, that there are altars to rebuild, fires to witness, journeys to complete, mantles to pass on. Elijah ascended to the heavens in flames because his story could not end in an ordinary way. He had lived extraordinarily, had confronted the impossible repeatedly, had been a channel for the supernatural to invade the natural so often that his exit needed to reflect the nature of his entire life. He did not die, because in a way, what he represented cannot die. The audacious faith that defies systems, the honest prayer that moves heaven, the courage to stand alone when necessary, the humility to accept weakness, the wisdom to mentor the next generation. All of this continues, passed from heart to heart, from generation to generation, waiting for someone willing to pick up the mantle that is still falling. You're holding a mantle now, even if you don't realize it. Elijah threw his over Elisha in a plowed field, transforming a prosperous farmer into a powerful prophet. Someone threw a mantle over you at some point, through a spoken word, a lived example, a truth that penetrated your defenses and planted seeds of possibility. And now you have a choice that Elisha had. Will you kill the oxen, burn the equipment, cut off the escape routes and follow through completely? Or will you keep your options open, one foot in each world, never fully committed to anything that demands everything? The answer to this question will determine whether you live as Elijah did, operating in the supernatural, confronting the impossible, falling and rising, breaking and being restored, eventually ascending to something greater than you imagined possible, or whether you live like the crowd on Mount Carmel, eternally wavering, never truly deciding, watching from afar as others dare to believe that fire can come down from heaven. The choice has always been yours. Elijah cannot make it for you. God will not force it upon you. But something in you recognizes deep down that you were made for more than what you have been living, that there is a call waiting to be answered, that there is a mantle waiting to be picked up, that there is fire waiting to fall if you have the courage to rebuild the altar and pray the prayer. So do now what Elijah did when he was in the cave, exhausted and ready to give up. Listen, not to the thunder, not to the earthquakes, not to the spectacular fireworks, but to the soft, gentle whisper that is speaking your name, telling you that you are not alone, that your mission is not over, that there are 7,000 others keeping the flame alive, that it is time to leave the cave and return to the journey. Listen, and then get up and eat the meal that is prepared for you, and walk, even if it takes 40 days through the desert, because something is waiting on the other side that will change everything. The chariot of fire will eventually come for all of us, one way or another. We don't know when, nor do we control how, but we do know this. What we do with the time between now and then determines whether our lives tell a story worth remembering, whether our mantle is worth picking up for those who come after, whether our fire inspires others to believe that the impossible is still possible. Elijah lived in such a way that when the chariot came, it made sense. It wasn't incongruous. It was a fitting end to a life that had repeatedly defied death, gravity, logic, and fear. He lived as if heaven were real, as if prayer worked, as if God listened, as if miracles happened. And because he lived this way, when his time came, heaven opened and received him in living flames. Will you live like this? Will you stop wavering and finally choose? Will you rebuild the broken altar in your life? Will you pray the honest prayer, even without guarantees it will be answered? Will you rise once more from the cave, even exhausted? Will you take up the mantle that is being offered, even knowing the cost? Will you believe that the God of Elijah is still God, that fire can still fall, that dead lives can still be resurrected, that the impossible can still be confronted and overcome, that you are not alone, that your story is not over, that the chariot is coming but is not yet here? So there is work to do, altars to rebuild, prayers to pray, mantles to pass, fire to witness. The answer is within you. It always has been. Elijah merely showed the way. Now it's your turn to walk it. And when you do, when you finally decide to stop negotiating and start living as if your convictions were true, you will discover what Elijah discovered, that God answers fire with fire, faith with miracles, honesty with presence, weakness with strength, despair with hope, death with life, and that in the end, when the chariot comes, you will not be afraid, because you will have lived preparing for that moment, one day at a time, one prayer at a time, one step of faith at a time. Now go, rebuild your altar, drench your sacrifice with brutal honesty, and pray the prayer only you can pray, the way only you can pray, in the moment that is exclusively yours. And wait, because the fire comes. It always comes. For those who have the courage to stand at the altar and refuse to come down until it falls. The God of Elijah is still God, and he still answers with fire.